Join us on a journey where we unravel the latest trends, tackle your burning questions, and explore innovative strategies that are shaping the future of compensation, all with a cup of coffee in hand.
Hello and welcome back everybody to Comp and Coffee. In this episode, we are returning to the topic of pay transparency. We just delivered our last briefing of the year, and one of my guests and I, Lulu, who's going to be joining me on the show today, where we covered all the legislative developments so far this year. So for all of you who tuned into that webinar, thanks. Q&A was very busy in that webinar, which indicates to me that many of you are struggling maybe to make sense of the new laws taking effect in the US, Canada, and the EU. And we know that pressure to get this right is mounting. So today we're going to try and help you with a general discussion around kind of what we're seeing in terms of legislative development, the kind of things we're seeing organizations struggle with, where we see organizations doing things well, and what we think you should do to make sure that you succeed at this topic. And I've got two great guests today joining me, two of my favorite guests for a chat. So we're all going to grab a coffee and generally have a discussion around pay transparency. So let's welcome them now. Lulu and Vicky. So Lulu Seikaly, would you like to introduce yourself again to the audience?
Hi, everyone. So happy to be back. My name is Lulu Seikaly. I'm Senior Corporate Employment Counsel here at Payscale. So aside from my advice and counsel for our people team here at Payscale, I work very closely with Ruth and the marketing team in the thought leadership space, where I track all sorts of legislation regarding pay transparency, pay equity, minimum wage, etc. So happy to be back on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Lulu. And then another longtime colleague of mine, Vicky Peakman. Vicky, do you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be back. It's been a little while. So I am founder and director of Fair Pay Partners. I used to work with Payscale with Ruth and Lulu, which was amazing. And I have sort of spun off and I'm now doing consultancy only on fair pay, pay transparency. I'm working a lot with some Payscale clients and other clients on the European Pay Transparency Directive and pay equity, gender pay gap, all things fair pay.
Great. Thank you, Vicky. Well, I think we're in good stead here with the three of us in order to have a fruitful discussion around pay transparency. So let's have a quick recap, although this could be the whole episode of like where we are in 2025 so far. We've obviously continuing to see new pay transparency laws coming into effect. And we're kind of closely watching how member states in the EU are responding to the EU Pay Transparency Directive and whether they are or not passing legislation. So, Lulu, let's maybe start with you. Can you give a kind of quick recap of what stood out most from this year's legislative changes, perhaps let's focus on the US to start with?
Yes, on the US side, we're still seeing lawmakers kind of copy and paste what other states have already done. There isn't really much innovation here. I'm much more curious to see what happens past 2026 and into 2027 to see if on the US side, we're going to see a lot of states start copying what the EU Pay Transparency Directive requires. Because as of now, most states just require posting a salary range in black and white on job postings.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Ames, your host of Signals, a Starbold Studios production. I'm taking bold ideas and real challenges submitted by leaders like you and turning them into powerful conversation with actionable results. Some weeks, I'll react in just 4 minutes. Others, I'll bring on experts for deeper dives. So send up a signal and I'll throw you a line.
Postings. Maybe some states take it a step further and require organizations to post a general description of benefits. And we're seeing a little bit more states start requiring organizations to provide pay bands to current employees. So we're kind of seeing that pay transparency requirement for incumbent employees more. So I'm curious to know how kind of this progresses into the next couple of years. But right now, it's still kind of no one's reinventing the wheel here on the US side.
Great. Thank you, Lulu. But we get to see a few more states come into effect in the second half of the year. Are we expecting any more in 26? Are there any more on the books to be passed?
So the last state that finally enacted their pay transparency law was Massachusetts. That was at the end of October. So for 2025, we're done. The next state that we know of right now that's going to enact their law is going to be Delaware, but theirs won't be enacted until the fall of 2027. We may see, I think Pennsylvania is the most recent state to reintroduce legislation. And then here in early November, there's a couple states that are electing their state representatives and governors. So I'm paying attention mainly to Virginia as an example, where the Democrat candidate seems to have a really good shot of winning that governor race. And if that's the case, then Virginia may also be the next state to enact and pass pay transparency, because those of y'all who remember, the House of Delegates in Virginia passed pay transparency and the governor vetoed it twice, two years in a row. So I'm hoping Virginia may be the next state to pass pay transparency in 2026. So we'll see.
Great. Thank you. Now, obviously, the other place we're seeing like activity is the EU now. We've had the EU Pay Transparency Directive in effect since March 2023. What we've been waiting for is the member states within the EU to transpose that directive into law. And they have a looming deadline of June 2026. So, Vicky, you're based out in the EU, and this is your area of focus. What's your summary of kind of like where we're at? And will we have legislation everywhere by the deadline?
Yes. We're not as far on as I was expecting. Let's just say that. We will definitely have some countries with the legislation by the deadline. Some we've got drafts out already. Some we just know that when they're coming soon. Others have actually implemented parts of it. So we've got Poland, we've got Malta already doing some things around it. But where we have all countries with legislation, I don't think so. I don't know about that. It really depends on whether the European Commission, what their response is to the Netherlands. So the Netherlands put out a draft. It was all going fine, but they've just had elections. So just ahead of the elections, they said, actually, we're going to delay this. We think it needs longer for implementation. Instead of enacting it and then having longer for implementation, they decided to not enact it but they only delay it 6 months. But they have said that they're going to delay it, and the reporting is delayed a year. And we're waiting to hear what the European Commission says, because if they come down really hard on the Netherlands, then no one else will kind of copy them. And if they don't say anything at the moment, we haven't heard anything, then we know that France and Germany and some others are kind of waiting to hear what happens. So a mixed bag over here on this side of the pond.
Which doesn't make it easy, I guess, for employers, because I know it's a hot topic for discussion. Everybody's saying, what do I have to do? What do I have to do? And
right. And the thing is, from a company point of view, if you're only in one or two countries, then obviously you need to be paying attention to what's happening in those countries. If you're only in the Netherlands, you could probably sit back and wait a bit. Whereas if you're in quite a few and they cover some of the ones that we know are definitely going to happen, then you just need to work out what's going to happen across everywhere. And then if you don't have to implement it, then you make a decision as to whether you do or not. But you still have to do it. It's not like it's not happening. It's just maybe slightly delayed in some places. That's all.
Yeah. And what happens if we do get to that deadline, like June next year, and some countries don't have the laws passed? Do employees have rights, like in alignment with the directive, or is it purely down to the laws being passed? Do we know that?
So there will be penalties for the countries, but we don't know what they are yet. But generally there are penalties from a country point of view for not, transposing legislation. From an employee point of view, it's an interesting one, because it came out quite early on that actually the individual rights would be covered anyway. But I heard recently that actually maybe that's not the case. And so we just don't really know what would happen if, for example, you as an employee, do you still have the right to, from your employer, even though the country hasn't transposed it because the European legislation says so? We thought that was a yes, and now we're being told it's maybe a no in those countries. So I think we're going to have to wait and see. From a company point of view, just get yourselves ready, because we don't really know till really close to the time, and at that point it's too late to then suddenly have to kind of ramp up to it. It's such a shame, because it's just hard for companies, and it's particularly hard for those people who are trying to actually actually putting processes in place, because there's people above them and legal advisors saying, oh, well, we don't know yet. So they're thinking, well, so they're not getting the budgets that they need, and they're not getting the buy-in that they need to actually make the difference, because people are saying, well, we don't know what's happening. And we do know a lot. We know a lot of what's happening. So we should be trying to get it ready. But it's really hard for those people actually on the ground implement.
And I think the baseline is that whatever you have to do by the letter of the laws when they come into place ultimately is all related to around whether you're paying people equitably within your organization. And if you haven't been tackling that, you've got a problem, I guess. I mean, we know many organizations have been tackling this, and but if that's something that you haven't even started with, you really do need to kind of get going there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So we're talking about organizations having to comply with the EU Pay Transparency Directive. It's quite a big bucket of requirements that extends well beyond what we've seen in US state legislation. From what you've been talking to clients about, Vicky, which parts of the directive do you think will be most challenging for organizations? And where do you think people are underestimating the lift?
Yeah, so one of them, like the main things, particularly for, I have to say, for some companies that aren't based in Europe, so particularly US companies, one of the big ones that's most challenging is the determination of categories of work, which is this jobs that are of equal value. And it's interesting what you just said about like companies who haven't necessarily been kind of doing this for a long time, looking at this. This is law that has been in the EU since the EU started, equal pay for work of equal value. But whether companies have actually been spending the time even getting those groups of workers of jobs of equal value, is a question. There's a lot of companies that haven't done that. They've been doing it from other ways. They look at equal value and they think of market value, or they look at equal value and they think of job titles, or whatever they've done, and they kind of got away with it. And actually suddenly now they've got to work out what these categories are. And it is really complicated for some companies, and that is harder. And there's a lot of other people you have to have buy-in. It's changing of structures potentially. Like, it is a big thing. So that is something that a lot of companies, particularly bigger companies, are really struggling with. And the other piece, which is like almost like the complete, so that's like the fundamental building blocks of this whole directive. On the other side, what should be quite simple is like the pay elements. In the end, you've got to, say how you pay. You've got to do some reporting on numbers. You've got to do the right to information on numbers. And actually, pay is defined as like every single thing that a person receives. And it's what they did receive in the past year. And actually, companies are finding that's so hard to find, because you've got payrolls all over the place. You've got different types of payrolls. You've got equity coming from a different place. You've got benefits coming from a different place. So getting all that data together in one place to be able to even start the kind of manipulation of the numbers that's required for is like way more complicated than I think people thought to start with. Because up until now, all pay legislation has really been on kind of base pay, maybe a bit of bonus. And now this is everything. So it's like a big lift for them.
So again, we know this is coming in some form or another. So start
both of those things.
Yeah.
Both of those things can be started. They're not, you don't wait for that, because actually they're kind of things you should know like anyway.
Yeah. And Lulu, from your perspective, which parts of the EU Pay Transparency Directive are most divergent from US legislation that our business may be more familiar with?
Yes, I mean, the good news is that there's a lot of parts of the EU Pay Transparency Directive that are already requirements in the US, like an example, salary history bands, not asking about prior history, posting pay ranges on job postings, or, disclosing those pay ranges in some other way during the interview process, and then pay secrecy bans. So in the US, pay secrecy bans have been in place for a long period of time. Those are three things that the directive is going to require for EU member states. Now, in addition to those things, there's a lot of things the directive requires that in the US we have not seen. So like Vicky was saying, this work of equal value kind of idea. So for American companies who now have to go into their European employee populations to figure out what the heck does work of equal value mean in comparison from, Joe Smith to Frank Sinatra. I don't know why I just chose Frank Sinatra, but Frank Sinatra, like how do we compare those? Pay reporting, gender pay gap reporting is not a common thing in the US. We only have California and Illinois as two states that have to provide pay reporting. This is in addition to the EEO-1 reporting that all companies who have 100 or more employees already have to do. And then the right to request information. So there are a lot of states right now that say that if you are an incumbent employee, you have the right to request from your employer your job title's pay band. Well, in the EU, this right to request information has to do with averages of men and women in similar job titles. So not just all senior corporate attorneys at Payscale, but all folks at Payscale who have similar kind of skills, effort, things like that. I think that's going to be really foreign. I think that's going to be the hardest thing for US companies to try and wrap their heads around as they try and implement the directive for their European populations.
Yeah. And if I reflect, I mean, this isn't like a cliff, because if I think back to when gender pay gap reporting came into the UK, we all scrabbled around to get ready to be able to comply with that legislation. But it was only probably took us another 1 to 2 years to really work out like what was that data telling us and how could we improve on that data. And then even with the US pay transparency legislation, Lulu, that requirement, many of those have been around. We still know people are not complying with it, or people are really struggling with it. We see lots of kind of like weird examples out there. So I think it's like, just don't be worried that everything has to be perfect by the date of the legislation. Any thoughts on that, either of you?
Yeah, I would say like Washington State is a great example of that. Oh, sorry, Vicky. I'll say very quickly, Washington State is a really good example of that. Washington State was the second state to implement pay transparency in the US after Colorado. And it's been, I think, about 2 or 3 years since that law has been enacted. And we just got some news from the Washington state government, basically giving a little bit more leeway to organizations to comply with that pay transparency law. So like Ruth was saying, there's still some runway. Organizations are still figuring it out. But at the same time, if you are figuring it out in good faith, that's going to be the most important thing. But not figuring it out like in malice is not going to be helpful for your organization. So Vicky, what were you going to say?
Exactly the same. Well, not about Washington, interesting, but the same idea that is about the good faith thing. Like companies are panicking that they have to get all of this. And it's like, you're not going to be able to do that. Now, if you don't know what your categories of workers are and you haven't got any kind of job evaluation at all, and you're just using sort of some salary surveys and you're not sure that's right, then we have to start where we are and then build on it. And I think if you say, okay, here's what we're using now for our categories, but we're going to spend time implementing a job evaluation system that obviously takes a while, well, that's fine, right? Because that's what's happening. Rather than everyone says, well, we're not going to be ready, so we're not going to be ready at all, and we just don't really do it, and we see what happens then. That feels to me like a negative way of dealing with it. Whereas, okay, let's see where we are now and build on it, and then we'll learn from other companies. We'll learn as we go along, I think is the better way to think about this.
To piggyback off of what Vicky's been saying is that, a lot of companies are panicking because they don't know what this directive in their country is going to mean for them. But there's still so many things that organizations can do to get their house in order. So that way, when that specific law gets transposed, they're still in place. So like, running pay equity checks to make sure that you don't have any disparities that you can't explain greater than 5%, removing your pay secrecy clauses, making sure your recruiters aren't asking about prior salary history during the interview process, getting your house in order, making sure you have job architecture set up, you understand how people are being paid, where they're being paid, how many employees per country you have. I mean, those are just 4 simple things that you can do that's going to help you prepare when you know in black and white exactly what you're required to do when those laws are being transposed in your country.
Great. Thank you, Lulu. So we've focused so far on legislation. I mean, I do love it. I love it when legislation happens. It forces actions. It's undeniable. It makes us take actions that I do think otherwise organizations wouldn't necessarily take. But I don't want to let this episode pass without us maybe thinking about maybe more holistically about the value of pay transparency to organizations, because I know it's something that all three of us feel quite strongly about. So it's this whole like compliance versus culture. It's very easy to just treat pay transparency as some kind of compliance exercise. But the real challenge and the opportunity, I think, is how you culturally embed pay transparency in your organization and use it as an opportunity to build trust. So, Vicky, you're working with many organizations, I know. What are you seeing among them where they're doing this right, where they're treating it as part of their fairness strategy and not just a legal requirement?
There's quite a bit of a difference between the sort of two types of companies that are kind of coming out. I mean, also there's people in the middle, but you know what I mean. And the ones that really want to get it right are the ones that are doing exactly what Lily said. They're trying to tidy things up now so that when they say how they pay, they can be sure that they are paying that way. And I think that's the whole point of the directive. It sort of requires you to say how you're going to pay, and then it requires you to show that you are paying that way. I mean, that's it. It's quite simple in essence, although the things around it are quite complicated. But they're thinking really hard about how to evaluate jobs. How can they show that the jobs that are in the group are the right jobs? What is the criteria they're using for pay progression? How are they explaining the differences between individual employees within the same band? It's quite a bit of work up front, particularly for those companies.
Sorry, Vicky's cat has just decided to join the podcast as well.
So yeah, so just to say, like, it's quite a bit of work, and I do think it's hard for particularly very large companies to kind of get this sorted. But you have got time, and I do think that those that are working up front and building this, actually, it makes it so much easier in the long run, because you then can be transparent. You don't have to be worried about like what can I not tell? Oh my goodness, I don't know. I'm going to say something out loud. Is it going to, when we do the numbers, is it going to show that? Like, they already know all that up front. So like, it is really worth doing, but it isn't an easy thing, particularly for companies that haven't really sort of been doing this in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound too radical, does it? It's like we should know how we pay people, and we should be able to defend to our employees in terms of how we pay people. Right. And I think part of the problem is there's the whole back history of inequitable salary decisions that have built up over time. And if you've got employees with like 20 years tenure in your organization, probably a lot of their pay history is like it's just like factored with lots. So there's quite a lot of mess to clean up. But we know most organizations don't intentionally seek to pay unequitably, but these things do creep in, either like historical decisions or unintended bias creeping into certain processes and systems when pay decisions are being made.
And I think that's a really, really good point. And I think this is something that I'm kind of advising clients more and more, actually, is that think about it in two ways. Think about it in going forward and legacy. If you now, from now on, from your annual pay review, you are paying intentionally, right? You know what factors you want to pay by. You are paying by those factors. If you're saying there's a 2% increase for a better pay performance review, you're giving people the 2% increase. You're not giving some people 10%, some people, like, if you are doing that in going forward, and all of your new hires, you are bringing into the range that you say you are, you're doing it intentionally, then what you can do is an analysis on your, like, from that, like that, showing that. So you're showing that in the last year we hired these people, there's no pay gap. In the last pay review, there was no pay gap, that sort of thing. And then you've got, how do we deal with all the legacy stuff? And that's a harder thing to deal with. And obviously that's going to take a little bit of time more to catch up. But if you think about it in those two ways, then at least you're getting towards, you're working towards getting it right over time. rather than thinking, well, we can't explain it because there's all this mess that we created like 20 years ago, so we won't do anything like about it now. Do you see what I mean? That's why I think it's like two-pronged approach.
Yeah, but it's having confidence in your pay systems that you can have a conversation with anyone in your organization about it.
That's right.
And you can defend it. I know, Lulu, you talk about trust a lot. I mean, I know you are lawyer in the house, and of course you're concerned about compliance, but I know you think deeply about, the trust that this can bring to organizations as well. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, like, obviously from a legal perspective, there are really great reasons why organizations should be transparent about their pay practices, not transparent in the sense of like, I know how much Vicky makes and Vicky knows how much I make, but transparent in the sense of like, we're running our pay equity checks at least on an annual basis. We're not posting $100,000 ranges on our job posting. We're not trying to hide the ball on, and we're not trying to circumvent the law by being shady and sneaky. But at the same time, Lulu the employee, not Lulu the legal mind, but Lulu the employee does understand too, like from an organization's perspective, there is a big reputational risk for being shady about those practices and trying to circumvent the law. Like you're going to erode trust in your current incumbent employees. You're going to find that it's going to be very difficult to hire top talent when you're looking to recruit. And then you may enter kind of this branding nightmare where you're going to have to start hiring PR agencies to run offense and defense for you because you've been blasted on social media for your shady pay practices. So, at the end of the day, like, yes, it is a compliance requirement, but it's a great branding opportunity. You're going to see your attrition numbers go down. You're going to find that you're able to hire really great candidates quickly. And it's just going to be better for your overall bottom line as an organization.
I think don't lose sight as the takeaway from this, that this is a broader issue than just compliance. Think about how it connects to the whole topic of pay confidence and culture and trust in your organization. So I had another question that was put to me the other day, which I thought was interesting, and I thought I would pose it to both of you as well. Pay transparency has obviously been a hot topic. We know people are knee deep in trying to make this happen within their organizations. So this question is somewhat future thinking, because I'd like to think we're in a place where this might happen. But someone asked me if we might anticipate backlash or transparency fatigue from employees or employers when this disclosure becomes the norm. Any thoughts on that, Lulu? Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I would say that there's like a balance between like overly disclosing your pay practices to the point of confusion and like actually trying to help your employee population understand it. Like the goal should not be that every employee at your organization is now a comp analyst. It should be explainable, very easy. Like I say this all the time, especially to people who especially like our data scientist people. I'm like, explain it to me like I'm 5. Truly, explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old. And that way that provides like a lot of clarity around these pay practices. Because at the end of the day, if you're providing too much information, there's too much noise, you're just going to add to the confusion. And then that trust again is going to erode at the same time. So you may have every intention of trying to be overly transparent, but at the same time, you're not being transparent. You're actually just causing more confusion to the chaos.
And Vicky, I know I teed you up to this question because we were talking about it last week. You've had a chance to think about it now. What are your thoughts? Will we get to transparency fatigue?
So I am really quite worried about this. Like I had a slight worry until I spoke to you last week, and now I have a bigger worry. I think, okay, so the idea behind the directive is great, right? It's about being transparent, everyone understanding the pay. We talked about it. Absolutely great. The problem comes with the complexity of implementation of it, and it's particularly around what's in a total pay, kind of what is pay. So pay is everything, right? There's an addition of all the things I was paid in the last year, including the cost of my medical insurance and, holiday allowance or whatever. I mean, it's everything. And what companies, and that's what they're saying, you have to provide that information. Now, that information doesn't mean anything to me unless I've got a great company that's provided me with an amazing total reward statement, which has got it all kind of, but even then, that would be a total reward statement, and maybe my target amount, so like the contractual amount, whereas this is the amount that I was actually paid, which had that deduction because I had to take time off, like all of this stuff comes into it. And my worry is that there was we were talking about companies who wanted to get it right. There's also companies that may just think like let's just provide the compliance numbers, right? Let's just provide what we need to provide. Okay, so I'm going to provide to Lulu her pay, which is an amount that she doesn't understand, and the average pay of men and women in that category, which she probably doesn't even know which category is. And here's 2 numbers, and she's going to go, well, what's that, right? And then suddenly, maybe you get over it by everyone going, well, I don't know what I'm looking at here. Like, so they kind of think it's nothing. It's almost like it's the opposite of transparency. You're providing it, but you're not actually providing anything. So the companies are going to put it into the compliance bucket and not into the opportunity bucket that Lulu's talking about all that kind of great stuff about transparency. And so I think it's a real risk that if you meet the directive, like exactly from a compliance point of view, and you don't provide any context, that you're missing a massive trick, and there's going to be fatigue from everyone. Good transparency is curated and it's guided, and as Lulu says, it's simple and it's clear, and it reduces fatigue, it increases trust. So like it's so important that this is thought about as a communication exercise and not as a numbers compliance exercise. And it worries me that because the directive is so complex that some people are sort of parting it off into the compliance bucket, which would be such a shame.
Yeah. But you are right. There are probably going to be lots of different versions of a person's comp depending on how it's been defined in the law as, that's the numbers that you have to capture, because we know that, for example, underneath the UK gender pay gap reporting requirements, the snapshot of pay that we use in that to calculate is not equals base salary. So, that whilst the directive is trying to bring clarity, actually probably there's got a high chance to confuse people. So I think we're going to be learning on the job quite a lot. Hopefully we learn quickly, and we can all learn from each other and learn best practice from each other in how to do that.
And Lulu's point about over disclosure then comes into it, because from my point of view, I'm like, well, I want to provide a load of context. So I said, here's the compliance numbers, but here's the numbers that are now, and here's the numbers that make it up. And then you come on with a massive amount of information, which is potentially too much too. So like, I think you're absolutely right. We're going to be learning from companies that are doing best practice. This first couple of years is going to be quite the fun journey.
It will be fun for us because that's what we do for a living. Maybe not for people who are having to do with it on the ground, but I mean, it's really, it's one of those really gnarly ones. You've got complex legal requirements and something that also really impacts culture and trust in an organization. And we're trying to bring all of that together. So there's going to be many challenges ahead. So thank you both for joining me today. We probably could carry on chatting for another hour or so, as we normally do, but thanks for sharing your ideas today. If you're listening in, if you have any other questions for me, Vicky, or Lulu on the topic of pay transparency and would like us to convene again, then do get in touch at coffee@payscale.com. In the meantime, we are currently fielding for our compensation best practice report. This is our annual study where we get input from many HR and compensation professionals about how they're handling all of these topics, everything from pay equity, budget constraints, and transparency challenges. The report is compiled and becomes available in the new year, and it's really a great resource for you to plan your strategy and your pay policies and practices throughout 2026. So its fielding will include the link to the survey so you can take that. I know it's busy season, but grab a cup of coffee, use it a bit of stress release, and maybe just breathe and take the survey for us. We really appreciate it. So thank you again, Vicky and Lulu, for joining me today. I'll let you say goodbye to the listeners.
Bye.
And thank you. And we will see you all again soon in the next episode of Comp and Coffee. Thank you very much.